From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power with David Westin.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Well, the big news of the day, of course, is that expected decision from the Federal Reserve coming out just over 1 hour from right now, 2 hours from right now, beg your pardon. And here to introduce us to it is Michael McKee. He's our Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent. So, Mike, you've been following the Fed for a long time now. Can you think of a day that's been as fraught for the Fed as this one?
Well, it's fraught for anybody who watches central banks because, of course, we had the big ad hoc meeting of the ECB today. Normally, I would come on and say, doesn't really matter what they're going to do today because we already know. It matters what they're going to say. But this is the first time in a long time where what they do today isn't quite certain. The markets were going into this expecting a 50 basis point move, and then we got the bad CPI report on Friday, and on Monday a series of articles in the various press publications suggesting that they would be considering 75, and now the markets have priced that in. You can see there we are pricing in, if you're on the radio, is two lines that go up on the right-hand side. The bet for this meeting and then for July, both 75 basis points at this point. And then, of course, what everybody's going to want to know is what happens after that, and that leads us to the dot plot. When the Fed put out the dot plot in March, it was much, much lower than the market thinks it should be now. So they're going to have to move up what they're saying about what they're going to do for 2022. The dots are going to definitely have to move higher. And then for 2023, how high is the median going to go? Where are they thinking they're going to stop now, given what inflation has been doing? So a lot to look forward to, David, as we follow the Fed today, and as you point out, more than usual.
Yeah, and we'll be watching it right along with you because there's a special on at 2 p.m. Eastern Time right here on Bloomberg. Thank you so much to Bloomberg's Michael McKee. Now we turn to an economist who really has been extraordinarily good at following the Fed and also predicting where it goes next. He's Stephen Stanley, chief economist at Amherst Pierpont. That's a Santander company. Stephen, thank you so much for being with us. In your note, you say the most important thing for the Fed today is to recapture the control of the narrative when it comes to inflation. What does it need to do that?
Well, I think they need to convince the markets that they're on top of it. And the markets have really lost faith. We've seen that in the wake of the CPI release last Friday. Obviously, there's been this violent reaction in the markets, which I think is basically telling the Fed, hey, you need to go more. You're not doing enough here. And so the Fed feels like the Fed is being reactive. And you'd much rather be in a situation where it feels like the Fed has control of the situation rather than being dragged around by the markets.
Well, so you're projecting a 75 basis point rate hike, as I understand it, Stephen, like a lot of the market is at this point. But what about the out months? What comes after that? Because when you're looking for credibility, do you want to be very specific about what comes next, or do you want to leave some leeway? Because right now, the Fed is a little on the back foot because it did say what it was going to do, and it looks like it's not going to do that.
Right. Well, everything is always data dependent with the Fed, right? And even that forward guidance that they offered in May of going 50 at each of the next two meetings was contingent on things playing out about as they expected. And of course, you can make a good case that CPI came in a lot stronger than anticipated, and therefore, the Fed is reacting to that just as the markets have. But I think you're right. There's always going to have to be some flexibility in and out. But I think it's remarkable to look at the evolution of market expectations around that question. If you go back just to the end of May, so just a couple of weeks ago, the markets thought that the Fed would be the peak rate of this cycle was going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 3%. And now that number is close to 4%. So we've moved almost 100 basis points in just a couple of weeks. I doubt that the Fed dots are going to move quite that radically. Or, I don't expect them to approach 4%. So there is a danger, I think, that the markets are still going to conclude that maybe the Fed is even now not being serious enough about the problem, and that's going to be a big task for Chairman Powell in the press conference to convince everyone that, hey, the Fed's got the situation under control, we understand, and we're on the job.
So, Stephen, I remember the last time when they came out with their economic projections, a lot of people said, we don't think this makes any sense because they kept a very low unemployment rate. At the same time, they projected that inflation would come down. How important will those economic projections be this time? And what do you expect in terms of unemployment?
Well, I think it's a bit of a wish list as much as it is a realistic set of economic projections. The Fed participants are asked to project the economy based on their assessment of appropriate monetary policy, and of course, right now, first of all, that's in flux, and secondly, I think different people will have very different assessments of what kind of policy evolution we're going to see, and so. In that sense, I think you want to think about 2023 and even 2024 economic projections that the Fed provides as this is what we'd like to see. And of course, we know that what the Fed would like to see is a soft landing. So the unemployment rate kind of stabilizing right around here, maybe ticking up a tenth or two, but not moving up in any significant way while growth slows down a little bit. To your point, I think the Fed projections for a long time have not really been internally consistent because as long as the unemployment rate is running lower than its long-run equilibrium, which the Fed pegs at 4, and in my mind might even be a little higher, the pressures on inflation are supposed to be continuing, and so you can't so much have your cake and eat it too, which is what the Fed, of course, would love to see, and that's what I think. That's where that contradiction in the projections comes.
And what about the relationship between the neutral rate and where they need to get to contain inflation? I mean, what will we see in terms of a terminal rate? And does that need to be significantly above what the neutral rate might be, whatever it is?
I think it does, and I think the Fed has kind of come around to that. If you go back to March, the projections, the dot projections showed that the Fed thought that they could get away with just moving a tick or two above, a quarter point or two above what they thought neutral might be. And they've kind of moved away from that a little bit, I think, as the inflation situation seems to have worsened. And now you're hearing more of the participants talking about maybe having to go significantly above neutral. So the first thing is we don't know where neutral is. And Chairman Powell at the last press conference, kind of rather than giving a precise estimate, suggested it could be anywhere from 2 to 3. And now I think what you're going to hear from the Fed today is that, hey, if we have to go significantly above neutral to get the job done, we'll do that.
Stephen, sometimes in order to go forward, you have to know how you got to where you are. And it's pretty clear that we got it pretty wrong when it came to inflation. By we, I mean both the Federal Reserve and the administration. We have actually, Sanya Carley, one of our colleagues, has a column out today in the Bloomberg talking about Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, admitting that they got it wrong. Well, the White House is not so much admitting. Do we need the Fed and, yes, perhaps even the administration to take us through where it went wrong and how they've made sure that whatever they're doing going forward will not have similar mistakes?
Well, I think that's that would be a great exercise, but it's not going to happen for political reasons, because I think a big part of the answer to that is that we overstimulated the economy with very aggressive fiscal policy, and the administration, of course, for obvious reasons, is not going to admit that, even though, as you suggest, Secretary Yellen has kind of at least hinted at that. And I don't think Chairman Powell can really do that because, he wants to keep arm's length. The Fed tries not to criticize the government or fiscal policy for good reason, because it doesn't want, pressure coming the other way. So I think, from the Fed's perspective, you have to take the hand that you're dealt. And whether that means a fiscal policy that in retrospect wasn't appropriate, whether it means all sorts of supply chain constraints that they have no control over. At the end of the day, the Fed has to do what it needs to do to get inflation down. And so I think rather than playing the blame game, at least for now, Chairman Powell is just going to say, hey, look, we're going to have to do whatever it takes to get inflation back down.
Going back a bit, Chair Powell has been telling us he has the tools necessary to get inflation down. But are those tools not quite as sharp as you might have thought they were, because households, and for that matter, a lot of corporations, have a lot of cash on the balance sheet, so they can keep spending for a fair amount of time after rates go up?
Yeah, that's a real risk for the economy, and I think that ties back to this question of overstimulus from the fiscal side. Households are sitting on trillions of dollars of excess savings that they accumulated during the pandemic, And some of that's going to get spent this summer, because we're finally kind of, effectively free of pandemic restrictions. And so I think no matter what happens with the Fed, we're going to probably have a pretty big summer for the consumer. Eventually, maybe the consumer burns through all that, but that's not going to happen in the near term. So I think your point is exactly right that inflation may come down eventually, but it's not going to come down right away.
Okay, Stephen, it's always a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much. That's Stephen Stanley of Amherst Pierpont. Coming up, the president's quest to get oil production up and profits down. We talk with Professor Sanya Carley of Indiana University. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Westin. To keep you up to date with news from all around the world, we turn now to Ritika Gupta here with the first word. Ritika?
Thanks, David. French President Emmanuel Macron says the lines of communication to the Kremlin have to stay open. Speaking during a visit to a military base in Romania, the French leader said fresh discussions between Ukraine and the European Union were needed to send a, quote, signal of support in a critical moment. His comments came after he caused an uproar by saying that the allies shouldn't, quote, humiliate Moscow and risk a peaceful dissolution. President Biden told U.S. oil refiners that unprecedented profit margins are not acceptable and has called for immediate action to improve capacity as high gas prices feeds record inflation. In a letter sent to top oil companies, Biden said his administration was prepared to take appropriate steps that could help companies increase output in the near term. And the Supreme Court has sided with hospitals in a case involving Medicare reimbursements. The justices unanimously ruled today that the federal government improperly lowered drug reimbursement payments to hospitals and clinics that serve low-income communities. That reduction cost the facilities billions of dollars. And heavy rain and rapid snowmelt at Yellowstone National Park triggered flooding that tore out bridges and damaged nearby homes. The raging waters may force roadways that were partially torn away to be rebuilt elsewhere. The unprecedented flooding drove more than 10,000 visitors out of the nation's oldest national park, which could stay closed for a week. Nobody was reported hurt. Global News 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Tape, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. David.
Thank you so much, Ritika. I want to follow up now on that story Ritika just told us about, where President Biden is concerned that the oil companies are not producing enough oil and they're getting profits that are too high. We turn now to an energy expert. She's Professor Sanya Carley of Indiana University, where she is co-director of the Energy Justice Lab. So, Professor, thank you so much for being with us. Is there anything, as a practical matter, the president can do to get production up and profits down?
Well, thank you for having me. And I think that the best avenue is to have those conversations with major oil companies to find out if it is possible to increase production. Although, as we all know, oil prices are impossible to predict, and they are very much political as much as they are economic. So those conversations could be crucial, but we don't quite know.
So one of the things the president has said is he's going to use emergency powers to increase refinery capacity, because one of the issues, as I understand it, is a bottleneck here. It's not just the crude oil, but it's the refined products. Is that doable in the near or medium term?
Well, it's doable if it's possible to affect those bottlenecks, essentially. But we are dealing with many, many supply chain issues across the United States, as we know, and across the world. And this is just one of many. So it may be possible. It may not be. It's still to be seen.
One of the issues that's been discussed, at least, is the so-called windfall profits tax, something that now the United Kingdom has imposed already, and it's being talked about here. In fact, yesterday we talked with the deputy director of the National Economic Council in Washington and asked him quite specifically, is a windfall profits tax on the table? And here's what he said.
We're open to a number of different ideas to tackle the energy situation and to provide additional relief to American consumers. As the president noted, in the first quarter of this year, the five biggest oil companies made $35 billion in profits. That's 4 times what they made in the first quarter of the year before.
So as you heard, Mr. Ramamurthy didn't say yes, didn't say no. He wouldn't rule it out, but he didn't say they're going to do it either. Would a windfall profits tax make any difference to the good side?
It could make a marginal difference, would be my guess. It would make a bigger, more substantial difference than just essentially giving a tax holiday for individuals within different states. but it wouldn't be a major relief. I mean, when we think about these gasoline prices right now, we know that gasoline consumption is still up, and that actually, as your last guest said, a lot of people are still spending the money that they've saved during the recession, or during, the pandemic. However, there are a lot of families that can't actually absorb these extra costs, and these are the families that really are at the margins and are unable to even drive their vehicles as a result of how high gasoline prices are right now. So, some kind of windfall tax such as this will not help these families at the margin.
Well, I don't know if you had a chance to look at the United Kingdom action, but as I understand it, what they're doing is they're saying we're going to tax the profits of the oil companies, and we're going to actually have a transfer payment to some of the less fortunate, lower income people who have to pay the most, because as I understand it, that's sort of a regressive tax on people. I know you're director of that Energy Justice Center out there. Would that make a difference? Would that help a lot of people?
Yeah, truly, if it's a progressive refund, if it's a progressive tax that we're giving back to the lowest income families, then it could make a difference if we are particularly mindful in that direction.
We also have the president now saying he's going to visit Saudi Arabia in addition to Israel when he goes over to the Middle East next month. Although the White House said they weren't sure they were going to talk about oil, I think most of us expect he's going to have oil come up in the conversation with the Crown Prince. What could Saudi Arabia do to alleviate some of the pressure?
Well, similar to the other major oil companies, if they expand their production, it could help reduce the cost of oil.
Could it have a reverse effect also? Because I've heard some people say Saudi Arabia is sort of a fleet in being, that they might be able to increase capacity and that keeps the price down. If they put their full capacity into it, would that communicate to the market there's no more excess capacity to be absorbed?
It's possible. It's really hard to predict, honestly. We don't have great estimates of exactly how much capacity or quotas are available, and so we do our best to guess.
So if you were advising the White House right now, they called you up and say, please, Professor, give us your best advice on what to do about the energy situation, what would you tell them?
I would tell them that we should focus on the more disadvantaged populations specifically, and we should think about how this is not just an issue of gasoline, but it's also an issue of other energy consumption, including electricity consumption, and that we are in the middle of a heat wave as well, which is threatening millions of Americans across the country, and that we need to have all-encompassing, a comprehensive strategy for reducing these prices across the board.
And finally, Professor, it's not lost on me that all of this energy crisis comes in the middle of what the Biden administration wanted to be a transition in energy toward renewables and away from fossil fuels. I mean, obviously, this has sort of interfered with that. To what extent can renewables step in and relieve some of the pressure?
Renewables can step in drastic ways, actually. We've learned from Texas over the past several days that renewables, wind and solar in particular, are saving the grid. The renewables play an immense role in all of this, and we are, in fact, in a transition towards clean energy sources, but sometimes we hit a bottleneck with our existing sources as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor, for your time today. Really appreciate it. That's Sanya Carley. She's Indiana University co-director of the Energy Justice Lab. Coming up, we'll talk with former U.S. Ambassador to Iraq and Turkey about President Biden's upcoming trip to Israel and Saudi Arabia. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
In honor of Pride Month and Juneteenth, Bloomberg brings you a special equality series every Thursday in June at 1 p.m. Eastern. Bloomberg Equality, celebrating inclusion this Pride Month and all year long.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. We always want to keep one eye on the markets, and today I think the markets are keeping more than one eye on the Federal Reserve with its anticipated decision at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. But to explain how the markets are set up for that, we turned out to Kriti Gupta. So what are the markets doing?
Some high expectations for the Federal Reserve. Of course, a lot has changed in just the last 48 hours, David. 75 basis points is on the table. It would mark the first rate hike of that kind of margin. It's going all the way back to 1994. Here's the problem. The market is so much bigger than it was in 1994. So one of the big concerns here is going to be the liquidity story. And that's for our TV audience. That's the chart you're showing. Essentially, as the line goes higher, to our radio audience, stick with me. As the line goes higher, it shows how hard it is for traders to basically get in and out of positions.
I have to confess, I did a double take on this because the higher the line, the less the liquidity. I thought it would go the other way. But so it's going up.
It's kind of one of those tricky indexes. But
it's the highest since the crisis, actually, back when the pandemic hit. Right?
Since March 2020, and that has been one of the conversations in the stock market, in the bond market, that these are, at the end of the day, functioning markets. The market plumbing is working fine. It's not the same stops that you're seeing, for example, that you did see in the March 2020 crisis. But then you take a look at a chart like that and you say, well, those liquidity problems, maybe they're not to that level yet, but they're certainly on their way there. And now, remember, it's not just the FOMC meeting today. It's also the start of QT. Quantitative tightening begins today. $15 billion of treasuries that are maturing today, they're not getting reinvested.
Well, exactly. We've got quantitative tightening taking liquidity out of the market. And I have to wonder, as I look at that chart and talk about the reduction in liquidity, I guess specifically with respect to the 2-year was really bad. How much that's just because the Fed seems to be veering? You know, if you're out there trading, you're not sure where the Fed's heading. I mean, the change in the projections over the last week or two has been dramatic.
Extremely dramatic. I think dramatic is putting it even lightly, because now you've gotten into a position where if you don't have a 75 basis point rate hike, then the market is going to interpret that as the Fed not being able to gain control. Remember, the last dot plot that we got, the last guidance that we've gotten on the record before their quiet period suggests that 50 basis points is what the Federal Reserve is going to announce today. 75 is what the market is pricing. 100 is what they're expecting. Some are expecting for the next meeting onward. So the question is, what kind of precedent is the Fed going to set today for those future meetings?
So assuming, as you say, that it's 75 basis points, that's what the market is anticipating. If you look at what the market is doing right now, I guess they kind of like that answer. I mean, equities are up, you know, bond yields are down. I mean, the markets are sort of saying we sort of like this result if it happens.
Right. And when we look at the 75 basis points, we're talking about Fed swap pricing, essentially. A lot of that nerdy part of the market that we don't cover that often. When you're looking at the nominal kind of, or the surface level, the S&P 500, for example, up 1.2% to your point, David. NASDAQ up 2%. But remember, we're coming off 2 days of losses, 3% losses on Monday as well. So some of this is purely technical. Some of this is going to be fundamental because of just how strong the belief is that 75 basis points is what Jay Powell is going to announce today.
So I want to spend just a minute on FX, because I know you like to talk about it. It's terribly important. It's the biggest market, isn't it, basally?
It is. $4 trillion a day, I believe.
Bigger than bonds. But as I look at it right now, it's interesting. The dollar is weaker against the yen and the pound. It is stronger against the euro. I guess we should spend just a minute on what happened with the ECB today.
Well, the ECB came out and they said, we are going to announce an emergency meeting. Yeah. A lot of anticipation baked into the markets, only to say, well, we're going to reassess our crisis strategy. And that's really all we got from them. Remember, one of the concerns here is that yields are higher when it comes to Italian bond spreads. The idea is, are we headed for another sovereign debt crisis that we saw after the last financial crisis, I might add. So this is one of the concerns coming in the market. Anti-fragmentation is a key buzzword from the ECB, essentially saying they don't want the periphery, Italy, Spain, Portugal, to separate in some ways from Austria, Germany, etc.
Fragmentation. Thank you so much to Kriti Gupta for the report on the markets. You can catch more of Kriti at 1 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Markets. Coming up, we're going to talk with the former U.S. ambassador to Iraq and Turkey about what President Biden can accomplish when he travels to Saudi Arabia next month. That's coming up at Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. I want to keep you up to date on news from all around the world. For that, we turn to Ritika Gupta with the first word. Ritika?
Thanks, David. The Biden administration will announce as soon as today that it's sending $650 million in weapons and equipment to Ukraine. Bloomberg has learned the weapons package will include, for the first time, vehicle-mounted Harpoon anti-ship missiles. Ukrainian officials have pleaded for more weapons and faster delivery to stave off Russian advances in the eastern part of the country. Global oil supply will struggle to meet rising demand next year, which means consumers will continue to face tight fuel markets. That's according to the International Energy Agency in its first assessment of 2023. The forecast says a resurgent Chinese economy will bolster consumption, whilst tighter sanctions on Russia will cut oil output. Shanghai is ramping up efforts to prevent wider outbreaks of COVID-19. The city will conduct mass COVID-19 testing throughout the entire city every weekend through the end of July, and a temporary lockdown will also be imposed on any residential complex where a COVID case is detected. Shanghai reported 2 new cases of outside quarantine facilities today and sent scores of close contacts to quarantine to prevent further spread. Americans cut their spending unexpectedly in May compared with a month before. The Commerce Department says retail sales slipped 0.3%, excluding vehicles. Sales rose 0.5% last month. The figures suggest that Americans' demand for merchandise is softening, which could reflect the impact of the fastest inflation in 40 years or greater preference to spend on services like travel and entertainment. Global News 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. David.
Thank you so much, Ritika. Well, yesterday we got official confirmation that President Biden will indeed visit Saudi Arabia, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, when he visits the Middle East and specifically Israel next month. And this will be something of a perhaps rapprochement with the crown prince there, Mohammed bin Salman. We turn now to someone who knows that area of the world terribly well. He's Ambassador James Jeffrey of the Washington Institute for the Middle East. Mr. Jeffrey has served as U.S. Ambassador to Iraq, Turkey, and Albania. So thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it, Mr. Ambassador. What realistically do you think that President Biden can hope to accomplish in visiting Saudi Arabia?
An extraordinary amount, David, and thanks for having me on. Let's go back to what your viewers have just heard from Bloomberg the last few minutes on American and European financial markets. The crisis the stock market and the financial sector is in today is largely a result of the Ukraine war, the shortage of oil, and supply chain problems, particularly in grains. And what President Biden is doing is shoring up the entire Middle East. He'll visit Israel. Then in Saudi Arabia, he won't see just the Saudis, but all 6 Gulf emirates and kingdoms, the Jordanians, the Iraqis, and the Egyptians. This is all our allies in the Middle East. He's telling them, first of all, we need you explicitly to increase, you Gulf states, hydrocarbons exports. Secondly, we need you to stand with us against Russia so that we can bring this war and the economic impact of it, as well as the killing and the destruction, to an end. And thirdly, in return for that, I am buying into your agenda very strongly of containing and deterring Iran, which is the one thing that unites all 10 of these Arab countries and Israel.
So obviously we have OPEC and OPEC Plus with Russia. Does OPEC Plus survive this conflict with Russia over Ukraine?
I believe it will, but only if Russia recognizes that the Saudis and other states in the OPEC Plus, the GCC states, are going to have to accommodate President Biden to some degree. Biden and the United States, the U.S. military, is their 911, and they live in a dangerous area. They also know that while Russia may be their buddy on oil markets, Russia is an existential threat to the global order, including the global trading order that they have so benefited from. So in the end, I think President Biden, with this wise move, will be getting what he wants.
So President Biden would like to have increased oil production. What about some of the other issues that have been pending? I assume that they're not going to talk a lot about Mr. Khashoggi, which was one of the issues. But what about things like Yemen?
Yemen right now, there is a ceasefire. Biden will discuss with the 2 most involved countries, Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis, how to maintain that ceasefire, how to ensure that this moves to from a frozen conflict, which has been for the last several months, to some kind of resolution. That also serves to show that the Biden administration is willing to push back on Iran, because Iran is deeply involved in supporting an insurgency against the Yemen government and striking through its surrogates in Yemen, targets repeatedly in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So this is an important part of it, but he'll also talk about Iran's influence in Iraq with the Iraqi government and all of the other states, the situation in Syria, and the overall risk of Iran going nuclear, which is on everybody's minds right now, beginning with the Israelis.
So, Mr. Ambassador, the news is coming fast and furious. We've just had a headline cross that President Biden now has spoken again with President Zelensky of Ukraine and has pledged another $1 billion in security funding to support the Ukrainians. You already talked about possible ramifications with Israel and with Saudi Arabia, with the UAE, of the president's visit. What concretely can be done? Now, I understand that Israel may be talking about possibly shipping natural gas to Europe to protect against Russia a bit. Is that feasible?
It's not feasible in the short term. Both Qatar, which is planning on increasing its annual BCM output from 105 to about 175, which is a significant amount. That's almost half what Russia has been providing Europe. Israel has capabilities too, but it's going to take a number of years to develop the infrastructure, be it LNG or pipelines for that. What is happening now is a move to increase oil production, because that's one of the major impacts on inflation. But secondly, to ensure that the diplomatic pillar of the overall military, economic, and diplomatic approach to pushing back on Russia is in effect. If Putin doesn't think he can undercut the West, if he believes he can no longer divide the West, that is going to have an influence on his decisions on the battlefield, and we want him to stop this offensive.
So, Mr. Ambassador, let's turn back to Iran. You mentioned it earlier. As I understand it, you're not necessarily a fan of the JCPOA, that nuclear agreement that President Trump took us out of. President Biden has wanted to get back to some form of that. How does Iran figure this out? I understand Saudi Arabia is a rival of Iran. They're very nervous about Iran. How does better relations with Iran figure into this? Because Iran could also ship a lot more oil.
Iran could ship a lot more oil. It's about 1 million to 1.5 million barrels a day. But frankly, the Gulf states could come up with about that amount, as could the United States under different circumstances pretty quickly. So Iran is not the salvation of the price at the tank problem we have right now. But more importantly, Iran does not seem to be willing to accept a return to the JCPOA. Biden has offered Iran a good deal, a return without any changes, lifting of sanctions. The Iranians are demanding new things, including lifting their Revolutionary Guard, which is their international, if you will, foreign legion that spreads terror around the Middle East. They want that lifted from the terrorism list. Biden will not do that, I'm sure. And so we're heading for a confrontation over the JCPOA, and that will further increase tensions in the region.
And finally, Mr. Ambassador, if I can just draw upon one other area of your extensive experience, Turkey. You're an ambassador to Turkey. What is the role that Turkey is playing in the Russian invasion of Ukraine at this point and getting the Russians to change their mind? Is it constructive? Could it be more constructive?
Any of our partners and allies could be more constructive, and all of them think we could be more constructive. So the answer to that is yes. But what Turkey has done is provide extraordinary diplomatic support to the Ukrainian government, try to serve as a mediator between Ukraine and Russia because it has good relations with both. It has cut off Russian naval reinforcements through the Straits to the Black Sea and Russian air reinforcements between Syria and Russia. Those are all critically important, but its weapons deliveries, particularly armed drones, have been the most important. Turkey, however, is also difficult because it's blocking Finland and Sweden joining NATO because of their concerns or their actions related to the PKK, Kurdish terrorist insurgency against Turkey, and its offshoots in Syria and Iraq. It's a kind of a complicated picture. Turkey could do more, but it's doing a lot. It's a crucially important bulwark against Russia and Iran, and the Biden administration needs to take the same approach to Turkey it has now learned to take with the Saudis. That is, even though they do things we don't like, they're big, they're important, they're on our side. We need to work with them.
Okay, Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for your time. This has been very helpful. That's Ambassador James Jeffrey of the Washington Institute for the Middle East. Coming up, we go over the latest midterm results with Joe Matthew, host of Sound On Bloomberg Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. It was primary Tuesday again yesterday in the United States of America as we move forward to those midterm elections, and we had some worth talking about. And when we talk about them, we certainly want to do it with Washington correspondent Joe Matthew. He's the host of Sound On weekdays on Bloomberg Radio. Joe, thanks for being here. I guess South Carolina and the House sort of got people's attention.
Yeah, South Carolina, pretty big night here, and it's reminding us, David, that the Trump retribution tour remains intact for the first time. And we've been through a couple of different states here where we looked at the impact of Trump endorsements. For the first time, though, a Republican member of the U.S. House loses his seat after voting to impeach Donald Trump. That would be Congressman Tom Rice. He never backed down from his position, and he lost badly to Russell Fry. It was a spread of some 25 points, David. So a bad beating in that particular case even as recently as a couple of days ago, leading into the weekend leading into this election, he was still hammering home on how he wanted reform instead of retribution. It just essentially blew up in his face. But there are apparently degrees of offense on this retribution tour when it comes to Trump. The very same state, South Carolina, we saw Congresswoman Nancy Mace, who's been on this program before. A lot of people know her outside of the state as the Republican who proposed legalizing cannabis. She managed to beat a Trump-endorsed rival after criticizing Donald Trump in the wake of January 6th, but not voting to impeach. Apparently, there's a difference. Congresswoman Mace lives on to see another day. By the way, that day she was here on Balance of Power talking with you, David, Congresswoman Mace went to Trump Tower and filmed a Twitter video reaffirming her commitment to Trump issues. Apparently, this tact worked. Nevada's the other one. Different wrinkle here on the Trump tour, where Republican candidates for governor both tried to out-MAGA each other. Adam Laxalt, who was endorsed by Trump, beat Sam Brown almost 20 points again. We're seeing big spreads in these primaries, David. Laxalt not only comes from a well-known political family in the state, he was also the campaign chair for the Trump campaign in Nevada in 2020. He will face Senator Catherine Cortez Masto for a seat that Republicans think they can flip. Masto is an interesting case here, where they really believe that that is a seat that they can bring over to the GOP side as they consider balance of power later on this year in November. David, that's the way things are looking.
Well, when you talk about flipping, what about South Texas? Because you had one flip, right, yesterday.
That's correct. Mayor Flores flipped a Democratic House district. This is interesting, though, because it was a special. So basically, she flipped it for a couple of months, and then there's going to be an actual election to find out what happens for the longer term here. But South Texas, again, looking at this as a Republican stronghold in the middle of a midterm election season that is threatening a lot of Democrats in this country, David.
Okay, Joe, thank you so much. Always great to have you with us. Joe Matthew, Washington correspondent, but more important, he's host of Sound On every day of the week at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Radio. Coming up here, President Biden points to his infrastructure plan to keep growth growing and cut inflation. We talk with the man he's charged with implementing that plan, Mitch Landrieu, former mayor of New Orleans. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Well, inflation is the topic of the day as we wait for the FOMC to tell us what it's going to do about it. And one of the things that President Biden has emphasized is the possibility of the Infrastructure Act getting implemented and really alleviating some of that pressure of inflation. We turn now to the man who's charged with actually getting that done. He's Mitch Landrieu. He's Senior Advisor and Infrastructure Coordinator for President Biden. Mr. Landrieu earlier served as Mayor of New Orleans. So welcome. It's great to have you back with us, Mitch. So give us a sense of where you are in this infrastructure. There was a lot of hoopla when the bipartisan infrastructure bill was passed. We don't hear too much about it anymore. Where is it?
Well, there should have been a lot of hoopla because it was a once-in-a-generation opportunity. $1.2 trillion to fix this nation's infrastructure. And of course, everybody in this country knows that many presidents have tried to get it done, but this president brought Republicans and Democrats together and made it happen. $1.2 trillion, and my job is to build a team, get the money to the ground, and then to report to the American people. And so in the last 6 months, we have talked to every governor. We have been coordinating with them to get this money out fast. We've pushed out over $110 billion. And on the lower the price side, on the inflation side, we've been investing heavily in roads and bridges and airports. But here, ports and airports, waterways and rail to help the supply chains get eased up. Now, this is a long-term proposition, but one of the things our country had not done well for a long time is invest in this infrastructure to move products more quickly. And of course, now we see how much more serious it is and how fast we have to go. And that's what we're spending our time working on every day.
Well, I don't know. To a simple guy from Michigan, $100 billion sounds like a fair amount of money. I know it's not all the $1.2 trillion, but that's already out the door. So give us some sense concretely. For example, how many jobs do you think have been created with that $100 billion so far?
Well, it's hard to tell exactly how many, except that everybody can see as they're driving around the country or as they're using airports, how much money is coming out of the ground. You see construction projects really across 50 states. We'll count the jobs over time. But for example, the president was in Los Angeles at the port just earlier this week. He was there a little bit earlier, investing in those ports to start getting goods from the ships to shelves are things that we're working on that we think long term will build America's capacity to move supplies quicker. That's what the big push is, and that's what we're doing. And $100 billion is a lot of money. $1.2 trillion is quite a lot more than that, and it's our job over time to make sure that we rebuild the foundation and the backbone of the American economy.
One of the things we've heard from the president and others is that infrastructure in success will relieve some of the pressure on prices, address some of the inflation issues we have. At the same time, how much more difficult is it making your job because things must cost more than you thought they were going to cost?
Yeah, I think, well, of course, that's true for everything. You know, inflation's a kick in the pants. I filled up my gas tank the other day, and I feel the same pain that everybody else feels. And the president, as you know, likes to say, you know, that at his kitchen table when he grew up, when gas prices went up, his daddy and his mama felt it. This is a long-term proposition. We have to rebuild the infrastructure of the country to make sure that our supply chains are bigger, faster, and better so that we never get ourselves in this situation again. For the last 50 years, every president and every Congress that had the opportunity to actually move us ahead did not succeed. The president did. And so that's why we're building deep, we're building strong, we're building long, and that eventually over time, as inflation goes down, and it inevitably will, we'll be better prepared than we are now.
How much of an impediment, both in costs and time, are some of the regulations you have to deal with? I mean, you saw that column from George Will, actually, in the Washington Post saying, you know, we can't keep up with the rest of the world because it costs so much more time and so much more money to do the same sort of work.
Well, let me mention two things. First of all, inflation is a global challenge, as are gas prices, which are higher, and the United States is in a better position to respond to it than any other country. Larry Summers said that today. But the point that everybody agrees with is it takes too long and costs too much to build things in America, and we have to get better at building big things that change us. We clearly understand that. And so we have teams of people that are working on permitting. We have teams that are working on regulations. But at the same time, we want to go fast, but we also want to build right. We want to do the right things for the right people at the right time, make sure that we don't have more regulations that we need and less than we need to make sure that we secure communities and make sure everybody has a chance to participate in the work that we're doing.
Is that something that the White House is committed to, getting some less regulation? Because we certainly heard that from Republicans. We don't hear it that much from the White House.
Well, that's not, let me challenge you there. You know, one of the first things that I did on behalf of the president was to bring together all of the agencies that are part of permitting and said that, listen, we want to do this on time, on task, on budget. We also brought all the inspectors generals in to make sure that we design these programs. We absolutely want to go faster. There's no question about it. Everybody in the country has to learn how to build faster and bigger and better. At the same time, we believe that you can build fast and you can build well. And that's just muscle memory, and it's just hard work. As the mayor of a city, you can't just think about what you're going to do. You got to think about how you're going to do it. How's the money going to get to the ground? Who's going to do it? How much time is it going to take? How quickly can you get it done? How are you going to put workforce together? We're thinking about all of those things, and we're working hard on making sure that it happens sooner rather than later.
You're the infrastructure coordinator. You're also senior advisor to President Biden. You have the ear of the president and the people around him. You've had a lot of experience in the state of Louisiana as well as the city of New Orleans as an elected official. What kind of advice are you giving them about what they can do about inflation in the short term?
Well, first of all, I'm not the economist in the room. And those are the folks that are working on it. As we're speaking right now, the Fed is meeting. As you know, the president said that inflation is his number one priority. He's got a fairly robust plan to deal with it. He wants the Fed to be independent and to take what steps they think are necessary to make sure that we get inflation under control. In the things that he specifically could control in partnership with Congress, he's asking Congress to lower prices on everyday Americans, from prescription drugs to housing to child care. And, of course, he's also trying to bring down the deficit, which he has successfully done to the tune of $1.7 trillion, which is more than anybody has done in quite a long time. On top of that, he's really calling on the energy companies to really kind of kick up their refining capacity and to make sure that they're doing more faster, given the robust amount of profit that they've taken in the last year as Americans' gas prices have gone up.
You've had the experience as an elected official of being frustrated. I'm sure that you're doing more than you're getting credit for. What can this administration do to get the word out, particularly with respect to infrastructure?
Well, listen, it's you know, there's a lot of stuff going on in the country, not the least of which is the fact that Vladimir Putin has decided to upend the entire global economy by his attack on Ukraine. COVID continues to stretch us, and lots of other things are going on. So, and people are worried about their day-to-day stuff. We're talking about infrastructure rebuild every day. But look, we're keeping our head down. We're keeping our shoulder to the wheel. We're going to be here for a while. As I said, this is a 2, 5, 7-year program that I hope will build muscle memory in this country so that we all can learn together how to build big things faster and better.
Mr. Mayor, thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. It's Mitch Landrieu,
It's
Senior
great
Advisor.
to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you, sir. He's Infrastructure Coordinator for President Biden. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and online. Coming up, Balance of Power will continue on Bloomberg Radio, talking with someone from the American Petroleum Institute on increasing production. This is Bloomberg.